everyone. Thanks for coming. So my name is Nicki, and I work for Mapbox, and I'm going to be talking today about recognizable labels for foreign map features. And so what I mean by that is if you're looking at a map at in a region where the local language is different from your own native language, how would you want this map to be labeled? And so today I'm going to be talking about some ideas for different types of label information you can display in these situations. And then I'm also going to talk about how we can think about evaluating the different label options. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some research we've been conducting at Mapbox into which options map readers prefer in these situations. And so I'm going to be focusing today on maps for travel because travel maps are one of the most popular use cases for maps of foreign regions. And so travel maps combine two kind of related goal-oriented tasks, so discovery and navigation. And so in other words, a travel map can help you discover new places or new venues that you want to visit, and it can also help you optimize itineraries and routes for visiting these places. And so this is kind of the context in which we'll be discussing labels for foreign map features today. And so let's say, for example, you're a native English speaker, which I think a lot of people today are, and you're going to go visit a foreign city, so perhaps Tokyo. And so we have a base map here, probably more useful if it had some labels, but we're going to start with a blank canvas right now, and I want to kind of walk through some different label options that you might have in order to make a useful travel map of Tokyo for an English speaker. And so the first thing we might want to map out is if you're planning a trip, you might think about researching sort of famous sites or destinations that you want to visit. And so these kind of well-known landmarks and tourist attractions, such as the Imperial Palace, they're likely to already have established English names, and so we can put these on the map. And so by an established name, in this context, I kind of mean a name that already exists outside of the context of this map. Right, so perhaps an institution has already given itself an English name, perhaps it's a name recognized by a government or like an international body, perhaps it's been published by reputable sources, but in any case, this name exists in the world and we can find data for it. And that's also true like if you're searching for maybe a hotel that you want to stay near the Imperial Palace. Hotels and other establishments that are designed to be frequented by foreigners already also likely have an established English name. So again, we can find that data. International chain establishments also often have an English name, particularly if it's an American British chain. And for example, the Shake Shack in Tokyo, we can definitely find that data for that name too. And in many foreign cities like Tokyo, you will likely find such establishments. So we do have some sort of points of interest that we can already label in English. But let's say you're in Tokyo and you don't want to eat at the Shake Shack, you want to go somewhere more local. A lot of restaurants in Tokyo won't have a name in English. They'll only have a local Japanese name. And so we can display that local name. You know, for the most part, that data is pretty accessible as well. So another option might be we can take this Japanese name that we have data for, and we can convert it into something a little bit more legible for an English reader. And so a simple conversion might be just doing a generated transliteration or transcripted name, such as this example here. And if you want to get a little bit fancier with your conversion, you know, you could do some combination of maybe transliteration and translation. And actually, my coworker, John Seilik-Glasman, just did a really great talk on different options for conversion of label names. So I'm not going to talk too much about this sort of label display option here, but if you're interested in that, I'm sure you can find the video online soon from his talk. Again, that's John Seilik-Glasman from Mapbox. And so another kind of label option that we have here is a more specific kind of category description of a points of interest. So let's say like you're looking for a restaurant, but you really want a specific type of restaurant, right? So maybe you really want to go to a sushi restaurant, and we can gather that kind of data as well for points of interest. So maybe we can display a category description as the text instead of an actual representation of the name itself. And so we kind of have a variety of options. There's other options that we could display, but I'm just going to focus on these options today. And so I think the next step, I think after sort of assembling like data options, is trying to evaluate how good these options are for this purpose. And I think the kind of first step is being able to quantify or qualify how meaningful a label is. And so how meaningful are the labels I just displayed to a target user, which in this case is a native English reader? And so I think that the most natural or common understanding of what that question means would be like, how well do you understand this label when you read it, right? Like, how well does it connect to pre-existing knowledge in your head about what this text means? How does this help you interpret the knowledge that you already have? But there's some potentially other ways you can consider a label to be meaningful. So for example, maybe a label helps you match up what you see on the ground, such as store signage, to what you see on the map. Maybe a label can help you search for a place on other resources, maybe other online sites, or help you locate a place that you read about somewhere else. So maybe you can match up this name with something somewhere else in the world. And maybe a label helps you communicate with another person. So maybe another English speaker, maybe you're traveling with someone and you want to talk to them about this place, maybe your friends and family back home, maybe you're meeting other tourists who are English speakers and you want to talk to them about this place. So a label can help you communicate. And it also can potentially help you communicate with locals. So with Japanese speakers, maybe you're trying to talk to a taxi driver or your hotel concierge or just a passerby on the street, maybe the label can help you communicate with them. And so a label on a map can be meaningful not only if it connects directly with like the knowledge that you already have, but if it also helps you acquire new knowledge about this place just from other resources out in the world. And so I think just kind of based on thinking about how a label can be helpful in different contexts, I think it's helpful to kind of talk about this idea of meaning or how meaningful a label is in sort of different dimensions. So the first is just how understandable is this label? Is the intended meaning of the label understandable to the target audience? Is it pronounceable to the target audience? Is it distinguishable from other labels on the map? So if you see two labels on a map written maybe in a foreign language, can you actually tell them apart? And is this label observable or directly referenced elsewhere in the world, again, such as on-the-ground signage or online? Can you find instances of this label elsewhere? And is it specific? So the information that you're gaining from this label, is it very specific to this instance of a feature? And so I kind of want to just like quickly walk back to the examples that we looked at in Tokyo and kind of look at them on this spectrum. And we can evaluate each label based on these 5 criteria. And so here is, again, our label for Imperial Palace, and it really hits most of the boxes. It's maybe like questionably observable because the English name is pretty well established. You can find it online. You can find it on the ground signage, but it's definitely not as observable as the local Japanese name. So this Japanese name for this restaurant, it is observable on the ground. That's likely the name that's on the store itself. It is specific, but for an English reader, it's probably not very understandable or pronounceable, or maybe even distinguishable from other labels, depending how familiar you are with sort of the visual representation of Japanese scripts. And just a quick note to say that that example of a local language label is in Japanese, but say the local language is French, perhaps as an English reader, you will find this a little bit more understandable and pronounceable, even if you don't speak French. So now we have the example of this just transliterated name, sort of converted from the local language. And you can see that this definitely has the benefit of being pronounceable and distinguishable, unlike the local language name. But it's not very understandable because it doesn't have a lot of inherent meaning. It's likely not observable because it is a generated name. And And again, if we're doing different types of conversion, like some translation and transliteration, this balance of like how much meaning it has is probably going to change as well. And so this category description here for this restaurant, sushi restaurant, so it's easily understandable, pronounceable, distinguishable for English speakers. But again, like it's sort of questionably observable. Like you could probably search for sushi restaurants in this area and you might end up with this result. Or you may be able to walk by this restaurant and tell that it's a sushi restaurant. So it's like somewhat observable, but not as clearly observable as a name itself. And it's definitely not specific information. Like it's not going to help you locate this one precise sushi restaurant if there's 30 other ones in the area. And so I guess a question that came up when sort of looking at these and evaluating these is, can we make labels more meaningful by combining them? So if some labels are kind of lacking in meaning in some dimensions, can we combine the labels to kind of make up for those shortcomings? So for example, if we have this restaurant name in Japanese, and we have this category description for this restaurant, can we maybe combine the two and kind of get a full spectrum of meaning for this label? And so now I want to ask, how useful is a label? Because we've kind of discussed how meaningful it is. And we've also kind of discussed how there's like different ways a label can be meaningful, and those different ways can help you access information in the world in different ways. So for example, like being able to pronounce the label really has the benefit of allowing you to communicate verbally. And so the question is not just how meaningful a label is, but how useful is that label actually in helping you to accomplish a task, right? Because if you're reading a map, it's usually like a goal-oriented endeavor, like you want to accomplish a task. And so there's probably different factors that affect how useful any particular label is for that task. And so the first is really what is the task? So different labels are probably useful for different types of tasks. And also like what type of map feature you're actually labeling and what the purpose of that map feature is for that task. So for example, if what you're using a map for is to try to discover new restaurants, the most important thing might be that you can really understand what the labels mean, and particularly the points of interest labels. However, if you're trying to navigate to a particular restaurant, perhaps there's like certain road intersections that are used as waypoints on your route, and therefore you really need those road labels to be observable on the ground. Like you really want them to match the street signs so that you can find your way. And so those are two very different types of sort of meaningful labels are used for different purposes. And then kind of following up to that, with that question is, how do we evaluate the relative usefulness of a combined label? So if we think that perhaps combining two labels will make it more meaningful, like how do we evaluate if that's actually more useful? And so I say relative usefulness because, so far I've been kind of discussing labels as if they were like individual labels, but really like these are labels on a map, and the goal is really that the map overall is more useful, not just that an individual label is more useful. And so a combined label is going to take up more space on your map, right? So you're really giving it more real estate, and you really want to make sure that that is the information that is the most useful to add. Because, for example, like that larger label might be blocking out another label for a different feature, so now you're showing fewer features on the map. So is that more beneficial? And so just to break that down, by relative usefulness, we're really evaluating the additional value that, say, putting like a local name and a category adds versus just either one of those. And we're really evaluating the fact that making that one label for that feature bigger is better than showing, say, two other labels. And then also, really importantly, I think, is considering how it affects the legibility of the map. So like if you have higher text density, that might make the map harder to read. And so leading up to this, what we really wanted to do is do some research with users and kind of test out some different label options and kind of evaluate them with some of these criteria. And we're doing research with native Chinese readers right now. So in 2017, there was 145 million international trips taken by Chinese travelers. And so really, Chinese readers are one of the largest groups right now of users in need of maps in foreign regions. So that's a huge market right now and a big area of interest right now for my company. And so we are starting our research first with native Chinese readers. And so for this series of studies, we tested 4 different label data conditions. So we tested out like established Chinese names, local language names, English names, and Chinese category descriptions, such as sushi restaurant. And we tested out 2 different label formats. So we tested out a monolingual label format, which is just showing one of these data options at a time, and we tested a bilingual format, which is combining 2 of these 4 options at a time. And we did 3 different types of studies. The first was a survey on label data preferences. And so we showed respondents a series of questions that look like this. We basically just show images of different label display options, and we ask which one is their preference. And within all those questions, we asked 2 different, we had 2 different types of conditions that we were testing. So the first one was which local language was used in these display. And we tested a series of different local languages that we thought might create differences of opinion of which type of label display people preferred. And a lot of this had to do with like the familiarity of Chinese readers to these particular local languages. And the second condition type we tested was the availability of Chinese name in our data. So again, like it's, we can pretty much predict what types of features might have established Chinese names and which ones might not. And so for ones with Chinese names, we would display that with various other options, like you see on the left. And on the right, this is an example of a feature that we assumed we would not have a Chinese name for, and instead we're showing a Chinese category description. So this example shows the description museum written in Chinese instead of an actual Chinese name. And then we used like similar conditions and the same data variables in a different type of test, and this was a user study with a specific task that we're asking users to do. And so this is an example of the kind of setup that we used. So we showed users 2 interactive maps, one with various monolingual labels, and they kind of varied depending on what data we actually had for these actual features. So this is not a mock-up, it does use actual data that we have. And then the other option was a bilingual label option, and again, various combinations depending on what data we have. And we labeled 3 hotels on this map, and we asked users to choose a hotel based on certain criteria, like we asked them to choose a hotel that was like close to a certain neighborhood, and we observed how participants used the labels on the maps to make their decisions. And so we did this as a complement to the survey because it's a little bit more realistic, so it's task-oriented. So this way we can really measure the usefulness of labels for a specific task, and it displays many labels at once, so this helps us kind of measure the relative usefulness. And the third study type, which we have not started actually conducting yet, is a variation on these 2, but we use participants on the ground at the location displayed on the map itself, as opposed to like a remote office setting. So this helps us get at the sort of on-the-ground use case versus a remote use case. And so we are still in the process of collecting all this data, so I'm not going to kind of give a summary of our results and conclusions and all that, but I did want to leave with a couple of just small insights, again with the caveat that we have not finished gathering all our data. And so respondents with some English language abilities really liked English names for being understandable and pronounceable, but also really importantly, I think that they really did value the labels for being highly observable, both on the ground and online, more so than Chinese. So a lot of times people looked at the options and said that they thought it would be a lot easier for them to search for the English name versus the Chinese name, even if we had a Chinese name. So respondents valued Chinese category descriptions when no Chinese name is available, but only if the description closely matches the vocabulary of users and is more clear and more specific than an icon. And they did find bilingual labels helpful, but varied a lot in which data pairings they liked. And so I kind of just want to leave with a final thought that really what we're trying to answer here is not what are the most optimal labels to display for a foreign map feature, but really how can we build label systems that are both flexible and adaptable to different users, different locations, and different tasks. Thank you.